Within you lies an archetype that feels both helpless and invincible. A paradox Jung shows is fundamental to our psyche. This isn't motivational nonsense. This is a psychological reality that shapes every moment of your life. How can the same inner child be at once abandoned and divine? Stay with this question as our guiding mystery. Deep within your unconscious mind lives an archetype so paradoxical that it appears as both divine child and vulnerable outcast. Jung called these primordial images archetypes, motifs appearing spontaneously in myths and dreams, independent of personal history. This contradiction isn't a flaw in your psychology. It's the very mechanism through which your deepest transformation occurs. What Jung discovered about this inner child will change how you see every struggle you've ever faced. But first, we need to understand where this mysterious child comes from and why it feels so utterly alone. Every person carries within them a child who was left behind. But this isn't about your actual childhood. This isn't about whether your parents were good or bad, or whether you had trauma or a perfect upbringing. The abandoned child that Jung discovered exists in every human psyche, regardless of your personal history. It's an archetypal pattern that emerges from the collective unconscious, and it shapes your emotional responses in ways you've never recognized. This abandoned child appears everywhere once you know how to see it. In your dreams, it shows up as a lost child, wandering through empty houses or being chased by unknown threats. In mythology, it surfaces as the hero who must survive impossible odds after being cast out by their family or community. In your daily life, it emerges as that sudden wave of loneliness that hits you even when you're surrounded by people, or the inexplicable fear that everyone will eventually leave you. Think about your emotional reactions when someone criticizes you, or when you feel misunderstood. That surge of hurt that feels disproportionate to the situation, that's the abandoned child responding. When you find yourself trying desperately to prove your worth, or when you shut down completely to avoid being hurt, that's this archetype protecting itself. The child within you learned early that the world is dangerous and that survival depends on being either invisible or indispensable. But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. This abandonment creates both your deepest wounds and your strongest survival instincts. The very experience of being psychologically abandoned forces the development of inner resources that would never emerge otherwise. Moses floating in a basket on the Nile wasn't just a story about one prophet's origin. It's the eternal pattern of how consciousness itself is born. The child must be separated from the familiar in order to discover what lies beyond the known world. Superman's origin follows this same archetypal blueprint. The last son of a dying planet launched into the void by parents who knew they would never see him again. This isn't coincidence. It's the human psyche recognizing its own fundamental structure. Every superhero origin story contains this element of abandonment because it mirrors the psychological reality that extraordinary abilities emerge only when ordinary support systems fail. Fairy tales overflow with abandoned children who face impossible challenges. Hansel and Gretel lost in the forest. Cinderella orphaned and mistreated. Little Red Riding Hood sent alone into the dark woods. These stories persist across cultures because they describe something true about human development. The child's exposure to danger isn't punishment, it's preparation for something greater. You've lived this pattern in your own life, even if you don't recognize it yet. Remember those moments when you felt most alone, when it seemed like no one understood what you were going through, or when you had to face a challenge with no help from anyone else. In those moments, something inside you activated. You found strength you didn't know you had. You discovered capabilities that surprised even you. That was the abandoned child archetype awakening your dormant potential. The abandonment creates the conditions for transformation because it strips away all external dependencies. When you can't rely on others to rescue you, the inner rescue system finally switches on. When familiar comforts disappear, you're forced to develop new ways of surviving. The abandoned child doesn't become weak through isolation. It becomes resourceful through necessity. Your defensive patterns formed around protecting this vulnerable inner child, and they made perfect sense at the time. You learned to hide your true feelings to avoid being hurt again. You developed ways to control your environment so you'd never feel that helpless again. You created strategies to ensure people wouldn't leave you, or you learned to leave them first. These weren't character flaws, they were intelligent adaptations to protect something precious. But these same protective mechanisms that once served you can become prisons if you don't understand their deeper purpose. The walls you built to keep pain out also keep authentic connection at bay. The masks you wear to appear strong prevent others from seeing the real you. The independence you cultivated to avoid abandonment can turn into isolation that recreates the very thing you were trying to escape. Jung recognized that every defense mechanism contains within it the seed of its own transcendence. The abandoned child who learned to survive alone also developed the capacity for genuine self-reliance. The child who experienced rejection also gained the ability to value authentic acceptance over superficial approval. The child who faced danger without protection also discovered that real safety comes from inner strength rather than external circumstances. This is why the abandoned child archetype appears most powerfully during life transitions and moments of crisis. When your familiar world falls apart, when relationships end, when careers collapse, when illness strikes, the abandoned child awakens. Not as a regression to childhood, but as access to the archetypal wisdom that knows how to navigate uncertainty and emerge transformed. Every time you've overcome something that seemed impossible, you were channeling the energy of this archetype. Every time you found your way through darkness without a map, you were accessing its navigation system. The abandoned child within you isn't a wound to be healed. It's a wellspring of creative potential waiting to be tapped. Yet this same child that seems so vulnerable holds within it something that defies all logic. This paradox reveals itself most clearly when you examine how real strength actually works. The most helpless thing in existence is also the most indestructible, but how is this possible? A newborn baby can't walk or talk or feed itself, yet it can survive disasters that kill adults. An infant has no weapons, no skills, no knowledge, yet it somehow makes it through situations that would break trained soldiers. This isn't sentiment or wishful thinking. This is a pattern that appears in every culture across all of human history. and it reveals something profound about the nature of power itself. Think about the children in myths who face impossible odds despite having no apparent defenses. Hercules strangling serpents in his cradle while still an infant. The baby Jesus surviving Herod's massacre when armed soldiers couldn't escape. Perseus floating helplessly in a chest on stormy seas, yet reaching shore alive while his persecutors perish. These stories don't celebrate childhood innocence. They reveal a psychological truth about how real strength actually works. What these stories reveal is that vulnerability becomes a kind of spiritual armor that deflects what would destroy adults. When you're completely helpless, you can't rely on ego strength or willpower or clever strategies. You're forced to tap into something deeper, something that operates according to different rules. The child archetype connects to vital forces beyond conscious control forces that adults lose access to when they become too invested in their own competence. Consider your own moments of complete helplessness and how they often preceded your greatest breakthroughs. When you lost that job, you thought you couldn't live without and discovered a career path that actually fulfilled you. When that relationship ended and you finally learned what real love looked like. When illness forced you to slow down and you found peace you'd been seeking for years. The very situations that made you feel most powerless created openings for transformation that wouldn't have happened otherwise. This connects directly to why trying to be strong often makes you weaker, while accepting weakness creates real power. When you attempt to control outcomes through force of will, you're working against the natural flow of psychological development. You're trying to muscle your way through situations that require a completely different approach. The child archetype operates outside the normal rules of cause and effect because it's connected to the unconscious processes that create rather than control reality. Your ego's attempts at control often sabotage what your unconscious is trying to create because these two systems operate according to completely different principles. Your ego wants certainty, predictability, and measurable progress. Your unconscious wants growth, transformation, and authentic expression. When these two forces pull in different directions, your ego usually wins the conscious battle, but loses the deeper war. The child archetype emerges specifically when this conflict between ego and unconscious reaches a breaking point. When your conscious plans have failed, when your usual strategies aren't working, when you've exhausted all logical options. In these moments of surrender, something else takes over. You find yourself saying the right thing without planning it making decisions that surprise you, taking actions that feel simultaneously risky and absolutely necessary. Real invincibility doesn't come from avoiding danger, but from developing the capacity to move through it without being destroyed. It doesn't come from eliminating weakness, but from finding the gifts that weakness brings. When you accept that you can't control everything that happens to you, you discover that you can influence how you respond to everything that happens to you. This shift in focus from controlling circumstances to developing character changes everything about how you approach challenges. The child archetype teaches you that true power emerges not from accumulating strength, but from releasing the illusion that you need to be strong in the first place. When you stop pretending to be invulnerable, you become actually invulnerable, because nothing can threaten an identity that doesn't depend on being untouchable. When you stop trying to avoid being hurt, you develop the capacity to heal from anything. This paradox appears in your daily life whenever you accomplish something important by giving up rather than trying harder. When you finally get promoted after you stop desperately seeking advancement. When you find love after you stop looking for it. When you solve a problem after you stop obsessing over solutions. These aren't coincidences. They're examples of how the child archetype actually operates in practical situations. True invincibility comes not from avoiding weakness, but from embracing it completely, because weakness contains information that strength cannot access. Your vulnerabilities show you where you need to grow. Your limitations reveal new directions to explore. Your failures teach you lessons that success never could. But this understanding of the child's paradoxical nature only scratches the surface of what's really happening within your psyche. Beneath your conscious awareness, forces are constantly at work that shape every decision you make. Right now, there's a battle raging inside you between forces you don't even know exist. While you go about your daily life, making decisions and setting goals, two massive psychological systems are locked in constant combat beneath your awareness. This isn't metaphorical language. This is the actual structure of human consciousness. Your conscious mind believes it's running the show, while your unconscious mind operates according to completely different priorities, and neither side fully understands what the other is trying to accomplish. Your conscious mind creates plans, sets reasonable goals, and tries to make logical decisions based on available information. It wants to advance your career, maintain healthy relationships, and build a secure future. Meanwhile, your unconscious mind processes emotional patterns from your past, activates archetypal responses you can't control, and pushes you toward experiences that serve psychological development rather than practical success. These two systems don't communicate well, and they often work against each other without you realizing what's happening. This creates a psychological tension that most people experience as internal conflict without understanding its source. You want to eat healthy, but find yourself craving junk food. You plan to save money, but make impulsive purchases. You decide to be more social, but then avoid social situations. You commit to exercising regularly, but skip workouts for seemingly no reason. These aren't failures of willpower. They're symptoms of deeper psychological forces pulling in opposite directions. Every decision you make is influenced by this invisible psychological warfare, even when you think you're being completely rational. Your unconscious mind evaluates every situation through emotional associations, symbolic meanings, and archetypal patterns that your conscious mind doesn't recognize. A job interview isn't just about qualifications. It's about authority figures from your past. A romantic relationship isn't just about compatibility. It's about healing, childhood wounds you've never acknowledged. A creative project isn't just about self-expression. It's about connecting with something larger than your individual identity. This internal conflict intensifies during major life transitions when the stakes feel higher and the pressure to make the right choices increases. You might find yourself paralyzed by indecision, not because you lack information, but because different parts of your psyche want fundamentally different things. Your conscious mind wants security and predictability, while your unconscious mind wants growth and authentic expression. Your ego wants to maintain its current identity, while your deeper self wants to evolve into something new. The child archetype emerges specifically when this conflict reaches a breaking point, and neither conscious nor unconscious forces can achieve dominance. Jung recognized that intense psychological conflicts create the conditions for what he called a third thing of an irrational nature to appear. This isn't a compromise between opposing forces. It's something entirely different that transcends the original conflict. The child archetype represents this transcendent solution that resolves internal warfare through transformation rather than victory. Think about times when you acted against your own best interests without understanding why, and you'll recognize this pattern. You sabotaged a relationship that was good for you just when it was getting serious. You quit a job that provided security right before a promotion. You moved to a new city without any logical reason, leaving behind everything familiar. At the time, these decisions seemed irrational or self-destructive, but they often led to experiences that changed you in ways you couldn't have predicted. These seemingly irrational choices weren't mistakes. They were expressions of the child archetype guiding you towards psychological development that your conscious mind couldn't see. The unconscious part of you recognized that staying in that relationship or job or city would prevent necessary growth, even though your conscious mind couldn't articulate what that growth might look like. The child archetype doesn't make decisions based on safety or logic. It makes decisions based on what serves your deepest psychological needs. Traditional willpower fails when these deeper forces are at work, because willpower is a function of the conscious mind trying to override unconscious processes. It's like trying to change the direction of a river by standing in it and pushing against the current. You might succeed temporarily, but eventually the deeper force wins, and you end up more exhausted than when you started. This is why some of your most important life changes happened not through determined effort, but through what felt like surrender or accident or fate. You stopped trying so hard to find love and met your partner. You gave up forcing a career path and discovered your calling. You let go of trying to control an outcome and found a better solution than anything you could have planned. These weren't random events. They were examples of how the child archetype resolves psychological conflicts that conscious effort cannot solve. The child archetype doesn't take sides in the war between conscious and unconscious minds, because it represents a level of psychological organization that includes both perspectives while being limited by neither. It transcends the entire battlefield of internal conflict by operating from a space of psychological wholeness that exists before the split between conscious and unconscious becomes rigid. It carries the blueprint for integration that heals the fundamental split in human consciousness. But this integration reveals something even more mysterious about the child's true nature, something that ancient wisdom traditions understood long before modern psychology. Ancient alchemists knew a secret about transformation that modern psychology has rediscovered. For centuries, they worked with symbols that seemed to describe chemical processes but actually mapped the hidden structure of human consciousness. One symbol appeared repeatedly in their texts, a figure that was both male and female, existing in perfect unity without conflict or division. This wasn't about physical gender or sexual identity. It was about something far more fundamental to human psychology. Jung recognized that this hermaphrodite symbol represents the child archetype's ultimate nature. The child contains within itself both masculine and feminine psychological principles, not as separate opposing forces, but as complementary aspects of a unified whole. This isn't about gender roles or social expectations. It's about the basic building blocks of consciousness itself. Every person inherits both masculine and feminine genetic components. And this biological duality reflects a deeper psychological reality that shapes how your mind actually works. These masculine and feminine principles operate at the level of how you process information, make decisions, and relate to the world around you. The masculine principle tends toward focus, analysis, action, and external achievement. The feminine principle tends toward receptivity, intuition, connection, and internal wisdom. Most people develop one side more than the other, creating an internal imbalance that generates constant psychological tension. The child archetype contains both principles in their pure, undifferentiated form. Before socialization teaches you to emphasize one over the other. Think about young children before they learn gender expectations, and you'll see this natural integration in action. A 4-year-old boy can be fierce and gentle, sensitive, and strong, creative, and logical without seeing any contradiction between these qualities. A 4-year-old girl can be nurturing and assertive, emotional and rational, playful and serious, without experiencing internal conflict about these different aspects of her personality. This union of opposites appears in your own personality as conflicting traits that won't resolve no matter how hard you try to eliminate the contradiction. You want to be independent, but also crave deep connection. You're drawn to stability, but also hunger for adventure. You value logic, but often make decisions based on feelings. You want to be understood, but also need privacy. You seek success, but worry about becoming too competitive. You desire peace, but feel energized by creative conflict. These aren't character flaws or signs of psychological immaturity. They're evidence that you contain multitudes that can't be reduced to simple categories. The part of you that wants security and the part that wants freedom aren't fighting each other. They're expressing different aspects of your complete nature. The voice that says, be practical, and the voice that says, follow your dreams aren't contradictory. They're both necessary components of a fully realized human being. Your conscious mind tries to create a coherent identity by choosing sides in internal conflicts, but this approach creates more problems than it solves. When you decide to be only logical, you cut yourself off from intuitive wisdom. When you commit to being only emotional, you lose access to analytical clarity. When you try to be only independent, you become isolated. When you focus only on connection, you lose your individual identity. The more you attempt to resolve these contradictions by eliminating one side, the more internal division you create. You don't become more integrated, you become more fragmented. You don't find peace, you create internal warfare. You don't achieve wholeness. You develop a split personality where rejected aspects of yourself go underground and influence your behavior in ways you don't recognize. Jung discovered that psychological opposites aren't meant to be resolved through elimination. They're meant to be held in dynamic tension. The goal isn't to become purely masculine or purely feminine, purely logical or purely emotional, purely independent or purely connected. The goal is to develop the capacity to access both sides of these polarities as situations require, while maintaining awareness of your complete nature. The child archetype holds space for contradictions without needing to resolve them, because it operates from a level of consciousness that exists before the split between opposites becomes rigid. It doesn't see masculine and feminine as conflicting forces that must battle for dominance. It experiences them as complementary energies that enhance each other when they work together. The child knows intuitively what adults forget, that wholeness comes not from choosing sides, but from embracing the full spectrum of human possibility. This is why moments of genuine creativity often feel childlike. They emerge when you stop trying to be consistent and allow contradictory impulses to collaborate. Your best insights come when logical analysis meets intuitive leaps. Your most meaningful relationships develop when independence supports deeper intimacy. Your greatest achievements happen when practical planning combines with visionary imagination. The hermaphrodite symbol acts as what Jung called a uniting symbol and a bringer of healing, because it demonstrates that apparent opposites can coexist without destroying each other. It shows you that the tensions you experience aren't problems to be solved, but creative potentials waiting to be expressed. The goal isn't to eliminate contradiction, but to find the higher synthesis that includes both sides, while being limited by neither. True psychological maturity means embracing your contradictions rather than eliminating them, because your contradictions are actually the source of your creative power. Every internal tension contains the seeds of innovation, breakthrough, and authentic self-expression. When you stop fighting your complexity and start appreciating it, you discover resources you never knew you had. But this understanding reveals something even more profound about what this unified child within you actually represents. It's not just a symbol of psychological balance, it's a blueprint for something that hasn't happened yet. Every hero's journey begins with a miraculous birth, but your birth isn't behind you, it's ahead of you. The moment you took your first breath as an infant wasn't the beginning of who you really are. It was just the start of your biological existence. Your true psychological birth, the emergence of your authentic self, hasn't happened yet. Most people live their entire lives without ever experiencing this deeper birth, because they mistake their current identity for their complete nature. But the child archetype that lives within your unconscious mind carries the blueprint for who you could become if you allowed your real self to emerge. The child archetype represents not your past, but your potential future self, waiting to be born through the process Jung called individuation. This isn't about returning to childhood innocence or recapturing lost youth. It's about accessing the wholeness that exists in embryonic form within your current personality. The child archetype anticipates the integrated person you could become when conscious and unconscious aspects of your psyche finally unite. It holds the vision of your complete self before that vision gets filtered through fear, doubt, and social conditioning. This future self exists now in embryonic form, but most people never allow it to be born because they're afraid of the transformation required to bring it into existence. You can sense this potential self in moments when you feel most authentic, when your actions align perfectly with your deepest values, when you express yourself without worrying about others' reactions. These glimpses show you what's possible, but they also reveal how far you are from living as your complete self on a consistent basis. Jung recognized that the child archetype appears specifically during the individuation process as a system functioning in the present whose purpose is to compensate or correct the inevitable one-sidedness of the conscious mind. Your conscious identity becomes narrow and rigid over time, focusing on limited aspects of your personality while ignoring or suppressing other essential parts. The child emerges to restore balance by reconnecting you with rejected aspects of yourself that are necessary for wholeness. Your current struggles are actually labor pains. As this new self tries to emerge into conscious awareness, the anxiety you feel about making major life changes isn't just fear of the unknown, it's resistance to your own psychological birth. The depression that settles in when your life feels meaningless isn't just chemical imbalance, it's your authentic self protesting a lifestyle that doesn't reflect your true nature. The restlessness that drives you to seek new experiences isn't just boredom, it's your potential self pushing against the boundaries of your current identity. Resistance to change is really resistance to your own psychological birth, because transformation requires letting go of familiar versions of yourself that no longer serve your development. Your ego identifies with your current personality and interprets any significant change as a threat to its existence. It creates elaborate justifications for staying the same, even when staying the same causes suffering. It generates fear about unknown outcomes, even when known outcomes have proven unsatisfying. The birth process in psychology mirrors physical birth in requiring a passage through darkness and constriction before emergence into light and expansion. Just as a baby must leave the safety of the womb to begin independent life, your authentic self must emerge from the protective shell of your current identity to begin authentic living. This transition feels threatening because it requires faith that something better exists beyond what you can currently see or control. Jung discovered that the child archetype carries divine qualities that represent your connection to something greater than ego consciousness. The child appears in dreams and fantasies with supernatural abilities, miraculous powers, and connections to transcendent wisdom. This isn't wishful thinking about your specialness. It's recognition that your deepest self participates in archetypal patterns that extend beyond personal psychology. When you align with your authentic nature, you tap into creative and healing energies that seem to come from beyond your individual resources. The child motif takes many forms in the unconscious, appearing as the jewel, the pearl, the flower, the chalice, the golden egg, and other symbols of precious wholeness. These images point toward the treasure that awaits when you complete the individuation process. Your integrated self isn't just a better version of who you are now. It's a qualitatively different kind of existence that includes capacities you can't imagine from your current perspective. The child archetype is your future self, calling you toward wholeness and authenticity through every dissatisfaction, every longing, every moment when your current life feels too small for your expanding consciousness. It whispers through creative impulses that seem impractical, through relationships that challenge your assumptions, through opportunities that require leaving familiar territory. It speaks in the language of symbol and synchronicity rather than logical argument, because it operates from levels of consciousness that transcend rational analysis. This influence operates continuously in your daily experience, whether you recognize it or not. The signals appear everywhere once you know how to look for them. The child archetype isn't just a concept, it's actively shaping your relationships and decisions right now. While you think you're making rational choices based on logic and experience, another force is quietly influencing your behavior from beneath conscious awareness. This archetypal pattern emerges through specific signals that most people overlook or dismiss as irrelevant. Learning to recognize these signals changes everything about how you understand your own motivations and opens access to wisdom that logical analysis alone cannot provide. The child archetype reveals itself most clearly through your dreams, where it appears as figures that carry special significance beyond their surface appearance. Jung discovered that the child shows up in dreams as the dreamer's son or daughter, a boy, youth, or young girl, but also takes more exotic forms that seem to come from distant cultures or mythological settings. These aren't random images generated by your sleeping brain. They're messages from the collective unconscious about developments happening within your personality. When you dream of children in danger, children with special powers, or children who seem wise beyond their years, you're receiving communications about your own psychological transformation. Pay attention to how you feel when you wake from these dreams, because the emotional residue often contains more information than the visual content. Dreams featuring the child archetype typically leave you with a mixture of concern and hope, anxiety and excitement, vulnerability and strength. These contradictory feelings point toward the paradoxical nature of the archetype itself and signal that integration work is happening beneath conscious awareness. The child in your dreams represents an anticipation of future developments and shows you possibilities that your waking mind hasn't yet recognized. Creative impulses offer another pathway through which the child archetype communicates its wisdom. The unconscious mind generates what Jung called fantasies that possess causal significance, meaning they have a role in shaping your experience rather than just reflecting it. When you suddenly feel compelled to write draw dance or express yourself in ways that surprise you, the child archetype is often the driving force. These creative urges don't emerge from your conscious planning. They arise spontaneously from deeper levels of your psyche. Most people mistake these influences for weakness or immaturity rather than wisdom, because they've been conditioned to value only rational adult thinking. When you feel drawn to activities that seem childish or impractical, when you want to approach serious situations with playfulness, or when you find yourself caring more about joy than efficiency, you're often receiving guidance from the child archetype. Society teaches you to suppress these impulses as inappropriate for mature adults, but Jung recognized them as expressions of psychological wholeness trying to emerge. Think about times when following your intuition led to better outcomes than logical planning, and you'll recognize the child archetype's guidance at work. You decided to take a different route home and avoided an accident. You chose to attend an event you weren't particularly interested in and met someone important. You applied for a job that seemed like a long shot and discovered your true calling. You ended a relationship that looked good on paper but felt wrong in your heart and created space for authentic love to enter your life. These weren't coincidences or lucky guesses. They were examples of how the child archetype operates through intuitive knowing that bypasses rational analysis. The child represents the pre-conscious childhood aspect of the collective psyche, which processes information in ways that conscious thinking cannot access. This pre-conscious awareness picks up patterns, connections, and possibilities that logical analysis misses because it operates from a more complete perspective. The child archetype guides you toward experiences that serve your deeper development, even when those experiences seem to contradict your conscious goals. You might find yourself drawn to people who challenge your assumptions, situations that force you to grow, or opportunities that require leaving your comfort zone. Your rational mind creates lists of pros and cons, but something deeper pulls you toward choices that promise transformation rather than security. This inner guidance system knows things about your development that your conscious planning cannot anticipate. Recognizing these patterns helps you cooperate with your unconscious rather than fighting it, because you begin to understand that apparent irrationality often contains deeper wisdom. Instead of dismissing impulses that don't make logical sense, you start paying attention to them as potential messages from your complete self. Instead of forcing decisions through pure willpower, you learn to sense when your deeper nature is trying to communicate something important. Honoring the child archetype actually makes you more mature, not less, because true maturity includes the capacity to access your complete nature rather than just the parts society deems acceptable. Adults who have lost touch with their inner child become rigid, narrow, and cut off from sources of creativity, renewal, and authentic joy. The most genuinely mature people maintain access to childlike wonder, curiosity, and spontaneity, while also developing adult capacities for responsibility and complex thinking. Learning to recognize and trust the child archetype transforms how you navigate life's challenges because you gain access to resources that pure adult thinking cannot provide. You discover that playfulness can solve problems that seriousness cannot touch. You find that approaching difficulties with curiosity rather than grim determination often reveals solutions you never would have considered. You realize that honoring your authentic nature creates better outcomes than trying to fit into roles that don't match your true self. This recognition reveals something profound about how real strength actually works in your life. The child archetype reveals that your greatest strength lies not in conquering your contradictions, but in dancing with them. You are simultaneously abandoned and invincible, vulnerable, and powerful beginning and end. This isn't a problem to solve. It's the fundamental structure of human wholeness. This week, notice when the abandoned yet invincible child appears in your life. Watch for moments when vulnerability becomes strength, when helplessness opens doors that force couldn't budge, when contradictions create possibilities instead of problems. Wholeness isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming authentically paradoxical, embracing the full spectrum of what it means to be human.